please. Ingvild Moe Elgsås is a senior fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. And she has a PhD in political science from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, and an MPhil in Russian East European Studies from Oxford. Among her research interests is the interface between Russian political elites and economic or security-related interest groups. And in her contribution to the project here, RUSECOPOL, she looks at Russia's strategic companies, including patterns of oligarch and Silovik leadership, with particular attention to strategic companies exploiting Russia's metal resources in the Arctic. So, Ingvild, the floor is yours. We're eager to hear about your report on state-business relations in the Murmansk region. Please.
Thank you. So, to start us off, what can I say about Murmansk? On the one hand, it's an average region, just one among very many oblasts in the Russian Federation, but on the other hand, it's a very special region. It is strategically important, and especially so in light of Russia's ambitious plans for the Arctic. The Murmansk region is very central to Russia's plans for the Arctic. It's also central for the country's economic development, as well as its military capabilities and its ability to project these capabilities. It is a gateway towards the Northern Sea route further to the east. So all of these things makes it very important, both economically and also militarily. It is the home base of the Northern Fleet, and since 2014 it has also been the home to the headquarters of Russia's new strategic command North. And combining all these economic interests, I should mention that mining and metallurgy is very central, fisheries as well. Combining these economic interests and the military interests in one region makes this region particularly important politically as well. So what I'll do today is present some findings from my studies of the political elite in the Murmansk region. Now the background, let me see if that's correct, yeah. I'll leave you to read that while I just quickly say that the background for this study is this understanding that interest groups have co-opted political power in Russia, and we've already heard a lot spoken about oligarchs and Siloviki. And the model showed by Andrei Yakovlev showed how the oligarchs were presumably very strong in the 1990s, but then the Siloviks have come and built up, and the relative weight of them have shifted over to the Siloviks. Most of these studies into these interest groups focus on the federal level, not exclusively, but there's a lot of focus on the federal level. And there is a question of how this manifests itself in Russia's regions. And it has also been mentioned already that the oligarchs sort of entered a conflict with the bureaucracy in 2002-2003, and presumably this sort of started was the start of the end of oligarchic power on the federal level. At the same time, it has been claimed that at this point in time, the oligarchies were alive and well, they were just in the regions. So practically in every region across Russia, there was an own oligarchy, with oligarchic interest groups having taken over gubernatorial power. Many of you are probably familiar with the studies of Krishnanovskaya and White on how the Siloviks moved into the political elite, and over just a few years in the early 2000s, as many as 1 in 4 members of the political elite in Russia was considered to be a Silovik. These numbers have been debated, and it's not entirely clear, but they also noted that the move of Siloviks into the political elite was especially notable in the regions. So my question then is, how is all of this playing out in the Murmansk region, a strategically important region with lots of military capabilities and also some core economic interests? So what I have done is that I have subjected the political elite in Murmansk to an in-depth study of representation from select sectors, 3 economic sectors that reflect the economic mainstays, as well as future prospects of the region, so mining and metallurgy, fishery and energy, and security, i.e. the Siloviks, to see how well these are represented in the regional political elite and how this representation has evolved across the post-Soviet period. So the political elite I analyzed it in two parts, reflecting the divide between legislative and executive power. So the legislative elite, the regional parliament, and the executive elite, the regional government. And instead of focusing on specific decisions and who got their way in this on that particular matter, which is very interesting but doesn't really tell us anything about the system and the systemic power that these sectors hold, I've opted for the positional approach. So literally people holding specific positions in these sectors and then taking up political offices vested with political power. So I'll just move straight along to some results. This table here shows the regional parliament. So it was first convened in 1994 and it is currently in its 6th convocation or term. As you can see, I've included the number of seats just that you can see the relative weight, because it's actually straightforward when it comes to the regional parliament, because one seat in the assembly equals one vote. So if you have a certain number of sector representatives, then they literally hold a certain number of votes towards the assembly's decisions. So within the red square, you see the number of sector representatives for each term. And then you can compare it to the number of seats overall. So then you can see the relative voting strength of the sector representatives. And as you can see, it started off with about a quarter of the seats being held by sector representatives. Then there was a jump to just over half of the seats in the second term. And since then, it has sort of remained relatively stable at around half of the seats in the regional parliament being occupied by sector representatives. I should mention that the electoral procedures have changed over the course of this period, and most significantly between the 3rd and the 4th term, when they departed from the only majoritarian races to it being a mixed system with majoritarian races, but also proportional representation based on party lists. But as you can see, this didn't really change anything in terms of the number of sector representatives that continued to be recruited, elected into the parliament. Of course, this is sector representatives seen together, so that's all of them. So these are sector representatives presumably pulling in different directions. But if we then sort of unwrap these results and look at what sectors were represented in each of them, we see that the M&Ms, the mining and metallurgy, they are by far the strongest ones, and that's how it has been throughout the entire period. Security started off sort of with just one, but they have gradually increased over time, and now they're almost on par with the miners, mining and metallurgy. So they're quite a big group as well. Fishery started low, and I know the fishery sector was very disappointed in this, that they couldn't elect more since they consider themselves this region of fishermen. So they started increasing a bit, but then again they have decreased. So there are not many. Today there's just one representative from the fishery sector. Energy is a bit tricky to describe because it fluctuates greatly. It's difficult to speak of any trends. There were none at first, then there were quite a few, decreased, and last term there were 5, today there's 3 of them. But the overall finding is the sort of relatively well representation from mining and metallurgy and the increase in representation from security. And so examples here, I'm not going to really go in on a lower level, but of course these are different businesses and different organizations. They're not all from one same. So Pechenga Nickel, Sierra Nickel, and once they were merged into Kolskaya Gemkag, which is always represented. Apatit is always represented. Amongst the Siloviki, the Northern Fleet, I think is the best represented. So this is then the legislative branch of the regional political elite and how sector representation in this assembly has evolved across the post-Soviet period. I'll just press on, I hope I'm good for time, to the government in the region. Now this is a bit trickier because the government is very much dominated by the governor, and they discuss things, but the governor has the final say. So it's not a matter of if you have so and so many representatives, then you have so and so many votes like it is in the parliament. But still, being included in the regional government comes with some leeway, some access to the governor, and potential to, at the very least, state one's case and potentially influence positions. If you see at the bottom figure, that one's cut short, isn't it? That's unfortunate. Okay, so the bottom figure, I'll just explain it, since this is all missing. So this is the composition of the regional government. So the green one, 45%, those are sector representatives. The blue, that's everyone else that I haven't identified as sector representatives. The yellow is people whose biographies are not detailed enough. I haven't really managed to ascertain whether I can trust that they don't represent a sector or not. So these are the unknowns. And so there will be more of these figures coming, but just so. This is the sector representative one. And the specific sectors, mining and metallurgy, security, fishery, and energy. It's not possible to get the text into the picture, is it, Jardar? Well, if it becomes unclear, then just give us a shout. So the first governor was appointed right before the Soviet Union ended in 1991. He immediately set about his task, and he was very explicit about his official policy of including the directors, the heads of regional big business and security agencies in his government as a matter of official policy. That was laid down in the regional administration's regulations. So there was no secret about this, and they were listed in government as director of Pechenga Nickel. It was their function in his government. Okay, we'll press on, I hope so. So metallurgy and security, the two top ones there. Yep. Moving on, Komarov lost the very first election in the region to Yevdokimov, who carried on much in the same way, increased sector representation overall, and you can see there's some differences, but metallurgy on top, as before. Yevdokimov was re-elected multiple times and secured all of the initial direct elections in the region, kept on increasing sector representation in his governments, and you can see there's a clear trend. And here, 62% of sector representatives amongst his members of government. Did I do that? Okay. So, something funny now happened. I mean, the political environment had changed over time, and these elected governors were no longer well seen. You were now supposed to become the president's governor. So Yevdokimov voluntarily stepped down so that he could secure the so-called approved governorship and be nominated by the president and then elected by the regional parliament. And that's when his government sort of also changed a bit, and he decreased sector representation, presumably, although the unknowns of members also increased, so we have to keep that in mind. And the different sectors also changed a bit, but not markedly. The big change came when Yevdokimov was replaced with a genuine Varyak sent up from Moscow to rein in the regional elite and the interests that had grown naturally in the region. So the lowest sector representation we've seen, but with a huge, uncomfortable yellow unknown. The sectors are very different from previous governments, with massive increase in security, fishery gone, and energy increased massively as well. Dmitrienko allegedly didn't do a very good job and had to be replaced by Kovtun, who I like to see as sort of a cross between Dmitrienko, who owed his loyalty to the Federation, and Yevdokimov, who was very good at regional interests and managing these. So Kovtun was the second, well, technically third, appointed governor, but she was in tune with regional interest groups, and she immediately started increasing membership from sector representatives. And it's not entirely clear quite yet, but she started normalizing the sectors as well. That became clearer in her second government after she voluntarily stepped down so that she could secure an elected mandate, because that was now the thing to be had. The fishery sector, though, has never recovered. So last year, she also had to go, more or less believably voluntarily, and was replaced by the region's second Varyak, sent up from Moscow, with no connection to the region before. This Chibis, I think, would be very much the young technocrat that Yekaterina was talking about. And this is very fresh. So obviously, these are completed governments. This one is quite new, so these numbers will presumably be updated quite a bit, but as yet, just a quarter of his members of government are sector representatives. Quite a lot of unknowns as yet, and sector representation looks a bit different than before. Now, whether this is the end of traditional sector representation in the regional government as we know it, we don't know, but it's interesting to see. Now, concluding, I assume I'm out of time. So yeah, sector representatives definitely seek and attain political offices in the Murmansk region. So it's considerable sector representation, but no one sector has dominated in terms of their numbers, and then needless to say, no one organization or company has dominated in terms of their numbers. But Marina Kofton, who was a sector representative herself from mining and metallurgy sector, was, she's the single most important member of the regional elite, so that is heavy weighing. Changes in recruitment procedures have affected sector representation in the government, but not in the regional parliament. So today the situation is so that half of the seats in the regional parliament are held by sector representatives. There is quite little sector representation in the regional government as yet. It'll be interesting to see how this develops. And the importance of the Murmansk region and how it operates, how it is being operated, will presumably increase in interest in the years to come. I think there's an Arctic strategy soon to come out, and Russia is about to take on the chairmanship of the Arctic Council. Certainly today these things are overshadowed by recent events in Moscow, but in the time to come, the Murmansk region and its elite will probably not be any less relevant, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. We will now hear from the next speaker. That is Ingrid Oppdal, who's also from Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies with a PhD from the University of Birmingham. At the Institute, she heads the Russian security and defense program, and her research interests is really much related to the relationship with Russian political economy and foreign policy. And she has a book forthcoming on this issue. In her contribution to this project, RUSECOPOL, she is looking at Russian energy companies in the Arctic and their relations to the state, and at elite groups with violence potential. Ingrid, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you all for your interest in our topics today. Now, my talk is on the challenge of being a strong state in the Russian Arctic. This is research in progress, and today I will speak about the difficulty of tasking oil and gas companies for regional development. You have certain aims, you have certain strategies, but you have to implement them. Or, well, do you, but you aim to implement them. So, to draw out the general background, I'll tell you a bit about Russia's oil and gas development in the Arctic, and then I'll go on to the state's plans, policy, aims, and strategies for the Arctic, also part of the background. Now, to task oil and gas companies to deliver on regional development, to get them aboard, also with the state's policy priorities, is something quite different than actually just stating that you have aims and strategies. So to illustrate that, I'll bring forward a small case study in the third part of this paper, which is going to be in the sort of completed research, one of several small case studies. And I'll outline some implications for what it means to be a strong state in the Arctic in the Russian case. One important conclusion is that delivering on policy is really a complicated task, especially as our previous session today showed, when considerations of short-term stability so often become more important in everyday political life. But this is crucial to deliver on policy. It's crucial for Russia's economic development and political development, also beyond 2024. There is, well, to be a politician, there also has to be some action. Now, just for the background, this is a map of Russia's Arctic zone, and I've strengthened the polar circle for reference. That is my only addition to this map, and if it's slightly uneven, that's just my hand. You might see that this map looks a bit different. It's based on a source from the Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment of the Russian Federation, so it looks a bit different from maps that we normally see. We discussed a bit before we started today whether the sea border delimitation is current, but in any case, the main point here is not the sea border. The main point is Russia's Arctic zone. It was defined by presidential decree in 2014. It is the geographic area that I'm talking about today. It includes, it's a motley region. It's not necessarily a very natural region because it includes 4 regional components of the Russian Federation and some sub-regions in their entirety, but it also includes parts of regions. There are some other issues with definition here. The Arctic zone, as defined, is not the same as regions designated as northern or near northern or subject to special compensation and support schemes, but it covers parts of it, the most northern parts of it. So there is some overlap in terms. Now, just a quick background on Russia's Arctic oil and gas. Now, in general, the context here is that significant parts of Russia's oil and gas production is moving north. And the northern regions are particularly significant in keeping up production in the future in 3 ways: the discovery of new fields, pushing the borders of existing fields, and branching out towards the north from already existing production, so that you have your production facilities, you have your fields, you know that there are good fields just directly to the north of existing production, and you just build on what you have. And also, of course, at established fields, you have enhanced recovery, which is a technological drive that's hitting the industry. Now, moving oil production north requires a lot of investment on the part of companies, of course, also on part of the state to develop the infrastructure. Now, part of the context here is that the high hopes for Arctic offshore mega projects from the 2010s, so the high hopes of 10 years ago, have not come true. The hopes are really high, both for the project best known in Norway, Stockman project, and potentially for others, because there are some good fields there, mainly in gas. So far, the only offshore production that actually produces offshore is Gazprom's Prirazlomnoye oil field. What has happened is something different. It is the Lng Mega Projects developed by Novatek. Best known is Yamal LNG. Under development, there is also Arctic LNG to the east of Yamal. These are onshore, near-shore gas fields with LNG production facilities where liquid natural gas is then exported mainly by sea. There is also some near-shore oil. Now, of course, the explanation is, I'll just outline it rather quickly. Well, importantly for all Arctic projects, there is a very high global price threshold for them to be commercially viable, around $80 a barrel or higher. The project, just the whole sheer complexity of developing an Arctic field is staggering. There were very long lead times. You need partners it's actually probably not doable offshore without partners. And you're very vulnerable to price volatility. So you really need a very stable outlook of rather high oil prices for this to come together. Of course, in the offshore, you have more constraints, not just the need for partners, but also now the international sanctions against the Russian oil industry, which targets specifically technology and finance for offshore projects. So there is an acute dearth of partners and finance, very few to choose between, and especially among the Western-based international oil companies that have that knowledge. And of course, you can't really access the necessary massive amounts of hindsight. And there are other constraints on the national level that I will not go into today. With hindsight, it's possible to ask whether expectations were too high. That would be an interesting discussion, Arild, at some point. But you still do have development onshore. So what are the aims and strategies that I mentioned in the beginning? Well, the current post-Soviet aims and strategies go back to the foundations of state policy in the Arctic from as late as 2008. The list of documents on the right is absolutely not exhaustive, but it includes top-level documents specifically on the Arctic and more very relevant documents that are not specifically on the Arctic. They, to a large extent, refer to each other. From 2008, there are two broad themes. On the one hand, you have strategic and security aims. And of course, the other aim, the other theme, is what I'm talking mainly of now. The Arctic zone as a part of Russia in need of socio-economic development, an object of development. Now, the balance between these themes changes somewhat over time, and naturally between the documents, but they connect in at least two ways. First, the Arctic is seen as a strategic resource base for Russia, and several of the documents see the Arctic as an object of global competition for resources. Secondly, national security aims have an important place. They take up a lot of space in the central policy documents, and they really frame a lot of the aims for socio-economic development. So state control is important. Control of resources matter because they are strategic. And control of Arctic territory, in the end, secures the state. Now, the economic development in the Arctic zone is here seen as underdeveloped, which is a bit funny because if you look at the entire polar regions of the Arctic, Russia's Arctic zone is actually quite developed. But of course, compared to the rest of Russia, it is underdeveloped. The strategic resources are seen to be of national importance, and of course those resources are hydrocarbons, gas and oil, coal, mineral resources, especially aluminium, but also rare earth elements. Now, the remoteness of most of the Arctic zones and its considerable resources have placed transport and infrastructure development on top of the list of priorities. So in general, one may see Russia's aims regarding the development of the Arctic zones as developmental. It aims to be a strong state. It implements narrowly modernizing policies. It's essential to actually deliver and implement. It is politically significant. Now, implementation has been a very sore point, and only over the last year have we seen an end, perhaps, or at least a better situation when it comes to previous fragmentation at the top level of the state among the agencies that actually are supposed to deliver. Which tells us a lot about when the state has a plan, still regional development is a complex task. You need to work with the oil and gas companies. They, of course, aim to generate profits, But they're also interested in a lot of other things, like maximizing their production, development options also in the future. So the state can create incentives, like tax discounts, subsidies. It might institute requirements attached to licenses and permits. But even so, even when companies are state-owned or indirectly controlled by the state, it's still a very complex process to make them fulfill state priorities for regional development, especially with the high costs. And especially, this is Russia's political economy. So the people in charge of the major companies, they sit there also as a matter of privilege. They wield real influence. They are politically significant entities. They have informal relations to the top of the state. And this is where the Northern Sea route comes in. At the top map shows the entire Northeast Passage, and the bottom map shows the part of the Northeast Passage that's in Russian terminology is the Northern Sea Route with a special administrative body, and, as we will now hear, special targets for traffic. So within a lot of the documents, and specifically the development program from 2014 and 2017, there was a lot of efforts, there was a lot of effort going in on behalf of the state to obligate the companies to contribute to regional development, but it was not sufficient. Nothing really happened. So when Putin returned to the presidency in 2018, he designated a list of a national project, major policy priorities, and quite quickly, it turned out that one of those national projects included targets for the Northern Sea Route. Now, the target was not just modernizing, expanding capacity, it was also increasing traffic. In effect, actually quadrupling it from around 20 million tons at the time to 80 million tons in 2024. 80 million tons of whatever, but whatever would have to mainly come from new oil and gas and metal export from the region adjacent to the Northern Sea Route, because traffic transit is very low. So setting a target for traffic was establishing a lever for influencing the oil and gas companies to actually come forward with their development plans. But it was still not enough. The target did not seem realistic, even to government ministries. Export on the route was set to increase substantially, but not enough. The ministries were not optimistic. The Ministry for Natural Resources started their first estimate at around 52 million tons for 2024. And other, like the government's own analytical center, was also very skeptical of 80 million tons. When the government started to coordinate their numbers, the estimates gradually began to increase. However, reaching 80 million tons still seemed quite difficult. At this point, Putin ordered the government to create long-term contracts with the companies to oblige them to ship on the NSR, raising the stakes further. The deadline was the previous 1st of September. And now, of course, the companies began to come forward because this was politically important. Except there was one company that had been really slow in picking up this sort of challenge. Rosneft, Russia's second largest oil and gas company, had not really responded to the proposals for increasing traffic on the NSR. But at this point, Rosneft came forward with a suggestion that would bring additional volumes onto the Northern Sea Route, but in turn, it wanted to negotiate for preferential treatment and tax discounts on already established production. So it wanted to make some money on what they were already doing and then offer a bit more. Now, in this case, the Ministry of Finance refused to support a sort of a retrospective tax discount, and this is where the case stands now. And the new plan for the Northern Sea Route development to 2035, approved by the government a month ago today, is based on forecasts that, perhaps not entirely realistically, imply that the goal of 80 million tons on the Northern Sea Route by 2024 will somehow be reached. However, to deliver in the longer term will depend also on offering up some sort of tax discounts and compelling the companies to invest in infrastructure. So we end with a set of sort of questions and dilemmas. So if you want to be a strong state as Russia in the Arctic, it's clear that petroleum will matter. But how? How to deliver on development plans? There are economic and political costs to any potential effect you want to attain. Because when you pursue economic development, you need your companies. But when tasking them in the sense of giving political directions, you might incentivize rent-seeking, and you open up a sort of a negotiating field. You may also, if you respond to their demands for additional tax discounts, for example, you may drive the economy in an unsustainable direction. So what is then a strong state? Is it possible to deliver on development no matter what? And what are the costs? And also, to balance that economic development with your other aims of reaching strategic goals, securing your territory, and having political stability, can you have it all in a region like the Arctic, where everything is so expensive? Well, I will leave it there, because this is research in progress, and I have more case studies to put into this particular paper. And thank you for your attention and your patience, and leave the rest for discussion.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I'm sure there are many issues we will have to return to, but you have done a great job so far. Now, the last speaker in this session is Janis Kluge from the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SVP, in Berlin. He, in this role, consults with the German government and the Bundestag in foreign policy matters. His research focuses on Russia's economic relations and development, on its domestic policy, and also on the sanctions. He holds a PhD in economics from Witten-Herdecke University and was a doctoral fellow at the Center for East European and International Studies. He has published in New Political Economy and Comparative Economic Studies on the Russian shadow economy and Russian elites' response to foreign direct investment. His contribution to the RUSECOPOL project focuses on how Russia's foreign policy affects the behavior and international linkages of business elites. So please, Janis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the extensive introduction and the warm welcome. Thank you very much. Thanks to the host. I'm very glad to be here today and discuss with this excellent group of scholars. So maybe just one remark. Before, and as you heard, I'm an economist. So as an economist, of course, I like charts. And so my presentation mainly consists of charts. Now you're prepared, and I hope it will not bore you too much. The topic, though, is quite an interesting one, and it has a lot to do with some recent shifts in Russia's foreign policy over the last years. So, of course, a lot has been going on there, but one particular trend which is important is the increasing significance of China for Russia. And this has been going on already for many years, actually, not just for the last few years, but especially since the Crimea annexation and the imposition of sanctions on Russia. There has been much more political will on the side of the Russian leadership to deepen this cooperation with China. And it has been successful on many levels, actually. One which is standing out is the cooperation in the military. So there we have seen some progress, especially in the last year, which has surprised many experts. But today I will speak about a different area, which is economic cooperation, which is an important and a crucial area for Chinese-Russian cooperation, but one that has shown so far rather ambiguous results. This is what my presentation will be on. It will have more of a macroeconomic perspective. And when we speak about Sino-Russian economic relations in the West, we often have in the West a very polarized debate. So on the one hand, we have those who say, there's nothing really going on, and everything fails that these two countries try to do together. And on the other side, we have these very alarmist perspectives, saying like, okay, with our sanctions, we're driving Russia into China's arms, and Russia will be dependent on China, and this can't be in our interest. So this is maybe a position that Emmanuel Macron sort of formulated in the summer. So I think the analytical challenge with this relationship is actually to take serious what is working out and what's actually happening, while keeping a sober look on all the handshakes and announcements and memorandums of understanding that are very strongly publicized by the Russian leadership especially. So and the main question that I would like to answer with the presentation is what has been achieved over the last years, what are the key drivers for this economic cooperation, and then also the question of asymmetry and dependency is always in there as well. And to do that, I will go through some basic patterns of trade over the last years in investment and focus then on the special issue of de-dollarization in the bilateral trade. And in the second part of the presentation, highlight some obstacles that there are to this cooperation, namely sanctions, Russia's own conflicting economic policies, and the high personalization of Sino-Russian relations overall. So I will start with a glance on trade. You can see here the development of trade basically over the last 20 years until 2018. And there are, you can see on the top, the Russian exports to China. On the bottom, you can see the Russian imports from China. This is nominal in $1 billion US. And what you can see is basically three things. First, there has been a dramatic, drastic increase in trade over the last 2 decades. The second insight is that this increase and the fluctuations that you can see on this graph are mainly dependent on economic factors and not on political factors so much. So you can see, for example, of course, in 2009 we had the financial crisis and the oil price dropped, and you can see this in the diagram. And also after 2015, I marked Crimea as a political event, but you can see after that, especially because of the low oil prices, the struggling Russian economy, and the devaluation of the ruble, that trade really contracted. And the third thing that you can see is that over the last years, you had year after year actually new record highs, and this is quite celebrated also by the Russian leadership in this bilateral trade. Also 2019 was a new record high. So this is in absolute terms, but if you look in relative terms, we can see that these records really depends on the perspective. And this is what we do next. On the left side, you can see the Russian perspective on bilateral trade. On the right, you can see the Chinese perspective. On the Russian side, you can see that China, especially on imports, which you see on the bottom, is now a really important partner with more than 20% dependency, with exports a bit more than 10%. On the other hand, if you look from China's side, you see that the significance of Russia for the foreign trade has not changed at all from the 1990s until 2018. Maybe a little bit more, but it's still about 2 or 2.5%. So it's really a very one-sided deepening in these economic relations which is going on. Now I would like to turn to the question, what kind of goods are actually traded back and forth, because there's also an interesting development that's been going on over the last years. This is on the next chart. You can see on the top Russia's exports, and the bottom Russia's imports from China. And you can actually see, I don't know if it's visible here, but that the patterns of exports and imports that basically flipped. So if you look back in the 1990s, Russia was actually exporting high value-added goods to China, for example, machinery. And it was importing really low value-added goods such as cheap textiles, furs, shoes, and some cheap consumer goods. And this actually switched gradually over the next years, and especially after 2010, a new pipeline was built and opened for oil export. You can see the minerals, which is mostly oil at this point, really expanded, while China turned from exporting low value-added goods to high value-added goods such as machinery, electronics. And this reflects Russia's, of course, technological rise and China's technological rise and Russia's economic and technological stagnation throughout this time. So you can see that this deepening or this maybe one-sided dependency is not only with regards to the volume of the trade, but also with regards to the structure and the goods that are traded. So one maybe information, the agriculture bar, which is also sort of increasing right now, is mainly timber and fish, what Russia is exporting at the moment to China. So what does this mean for dependency? Maybe you can also maybe already draw a bottom line. At this point, you can say that as I said, it increased. But from the perspective of the Russian elites, this might be more perceived as a diversification, because an economy like Russia's will always be dependent on some outside economies. At the moment, it is hugely dependent on Western economies. And especially since the imposition of the sanctions, this interdependency with the West is seen as a threat, as a risk. And so I think that from the perspective of the Russian elites, more dependency from China, if you trade this and diversify, it's actually nothing that they are worried about so much at this point. So how will trade develop in the next years? There was an announcement last September by the former Prime Minister Medvedev and Li Keqiang, the Prime Minister of China. They wanted to double trade basically over the next years. It's quite questionable if this is going to be achieved. The most notable changes are going to be the increasing role of natural gas. We heard already about the LNG terminals. They're slowly ramping up and they're exporting also to China. And then you probably also saw the opening of the Power of Siberia pipeline, which will bring pipeline gas to China, and this will also ramp up over the next years. It's not a very quick process, but until 2025 should reach its capacity. If both of these developments appear according to plan, you will see that natural gas will play about the same role as agriculture at the moment. So it will not surpass oil in any case. Oil is still dominant, but it will play its own role. Then there will be a bit more agriculture export. You can already see that China's opening up its markets for Russian meat exports. And finally, you can actually see an increase in Chinese tourism to Russia. So there's a services trade. This is a quite explosive development that you can really see in the Russian capital, especially. But if you look at the statistics, actually, it's just 1%, about the trade total. Around 1 billion per year is what Chinese spend in Russia. So this is as a bottom line to the developments in trade. Now turning to the developments in investment, and maybe investment is the one area where the Western sanctions, of course, hurt the most. And it's the one area where the most hopes connected to China, and also, I would say, at this point, the most disappointments. First of all, one has to say that it is extremely difficult to really tell precisely how much Chinese investment there is in Russia today. So I tried to compile statistics from the central bank, Russian central bank, and the Ministry of Commerce in China. I will just quickly go over it. You can see the FDI flows, the annual flows in the top. You can see that it's around 1 billion, 2 billion per year, depending on if you look at the Ministry of Commerce in red or the central bank's data in blue. And then you can look at the accumulated FDI stocks, foreign direct investment stocks. You can also see a difference between Ministry of Commerce. They say about 14 billion in 2018. The Central Bank of Russia says about 3.6 billion. This huge discrepancy comes about because investment into Russia is mostly flowing through some international offshore financial centers such as Cyprus. Some of the biggest investments to Russia from China have gone through Cyprus, for example, and this massively distorts FDI statistics. The Ministry of Commerce tries to account for this a little bit. There are some projects that really try to actually count projects and get a more reliable figure through this. But still, they are looking at maybe 30, 35 billion of Chinese investment over the last years. Still, if you take all that and take the largest numbers, it's really still a very small number. For example, from the Chinese perspective, this outgoing investment to Russia is 0.7% of the total outgoing investment from China abroad, including Hong Kong. If you look at the Russian incoming foreign direct investment, this is about 1% of the incoming investment to Russia. And a country, for example, like Germany, invests 5 times as much in Russia today as China does. So, as I said, you have to consider that this is very difficult to get this kind of data, but you can already see that not very much has happened at this point. And you can also see, if you look at the projects, it's about 2/3 is focused on energy projects. It's mostly from Chinese state companies, because for Chinese private companies, it's very risky to invest in Russia. And it's mostly focused on companies which have, through their executives, some closer ties to the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, which is also some sort of risk hedging probably, but also some exchange of favors between the Chinese leadership and the Russian leadership possibly. So why is this the case? Why has there been so little investment in Russia? The answer is actually quite easy. It's that Chinese firms face exactly the same hurdles and the same difficulties and the same problems in Russia that also Western firms face when they invest there. So you have the same bureaucracy, the hurdles, you have the very difficult economic circumstances, economic stagnation, so the market might not be that interesting at the moment. And also you have just very little experience from Chinese actors and Russian actors with each other. So this is kind of, which is at the moment, limiting investment of Chinese companies in Russia by a lot. So I quickly want to turn to the third issue where there's a bit more progress, and this is the question of de-dollarization. So it is the common goal of Russia and China to limit the role of the US dollar in the world economy, but particularly in their bilateral trade. All trade that is settled in US dollars is more susceptible to sanctions, and also it's the goal of these two countries to push their own currencies, the ruble and the yuan, for foreign trade. Now the developments here have been quite sudden and quite interesting. If you compare 2014 to 2019, you can actually see that with regards to Russian exports, it used to be 99% settled in US dollars. And at the moment, you have less than half is in US dollars and more than half is actually in euros, which is kind of surprising at first. You have a little, small percentage in yuan, a small percentage in ruble. So it turned out that the euro was the most convenient currency for both the Chinese and the Russian companies, which was not the US dollar. This is why they chose it, and because it's such a drastic development and so quick, the only possible explanation for this is that it's connected to the state companies and probably Rosneft's oil exports to China, which have been switched from dollar to euro settlements. If you look at the Russian imports from China, you can see that the development is much more gradual. And here you can see that the US dollar in blue in the bottom is also losing from about 95 to maybe 67%. But the main beneficiary in this case is the yuan. So in this case, China actually manages to impose its currency policy on the bilateral trade between Russia and China. To conclude my presentation, I would just like to quickly go over some of the main obstacles at the moment, which are still there between Russian and Chinese economic relations. And the first one is maybe counterintuitive, because it's the Western sanctions and the trade conflict of the United States and China. So, you maybe could say that the Western sanctions are an incentive for Russian firms to turn to China, but in fact, it makes it much more difficult for Russian firms to engage with Chinese partners. For example, Chinese banks are very reluctant to do business with Russian firms because of sanctions risk, and they are very much afraid of reaching sanctions. So they're very strict in carrying out US and EU sanctions against Russia. Then the trade conflict. Again, you could say that Russia might benefit from this because it could export LNG or agriculture goods to China. But actually, Russian exports suffer from the trade conflict because it slows down Chinese economic growth, and it lowers the demand for the most important export good, which is oil. And also it makes the Chinese leadership much more careful in what they do with Russia, because they don't want to aggravate this conflict with the United States. Then the second obstacle is that Russia has very conflicting economic policies, and this economic turn to the east is not the only one. There's another one, which is the turn to itself. So, this policies that are aimed at, making the economy more sovereign, making it more national, import substitution, and erecting some different sorts of trade barriers and protectionism. This is probably a more dominant economic policy at the moment in Russia than this turn to the east, and Chinese-Russian economic relations also suffer from this. And the third problem, or maybe risk for the future, is the high personalization of the economic relation between both countries. And much has been said about the political regimes in Russia and in China becoming more personalized over the last years, and this is also true about this Xi and Putin relationship. Much has been written about this. You probably cannot take everything at face value, but it's clear that this facilitates some parts of the deals that are made. But this is not also only on the top level. Also on the below, you already heard about the energy companies. If you have the key executives that are responsible for the increasing trade with China, they are extremely powerful within Russia and mainly controlled by the president personally and not by the Russian institutions. So the problem why this is a risk is that whenever there's going to be a change, and on the Chinese side it has happened, maybe you can go to this in the discussion, these personal connections, they can fall apart. And at the moment, it is just very difficult to imagine Sino-Russian cooperation to continue like it says, developed in the last years with a different president or without Vladimir Putin. It's just at the moment, because of this high personalization of these relations and the networks which are engaged with China, it is very difficult to imagine. So wrapping up, what you can see is that you have a gradual deepening in relations coming, especially if the sanctions pressure is eased. That would actually help Sino-Russian relations. You see that Russia becomes, with regards to its economy, more diversified internationally. And finally, you can also see, though, that Russia is becoming less diversified with regards to its own economy. So you see that with China also, oil and gas, again, is the one sector which is dominating. I will wrap up with this, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Janice, and please have all the presenters take a seat here. Yes, I think we will move straight on to questions from the audience. As before, please introduce yourself and wait till you have a microphone headed to you. Do you see anybody here? Yes, I think it's all good. Gunnar Skagestad first.
Thank you. Odd Gunnar Skagestad, independent analyst. Ingrid Opdahl raised the question of whether it's possible to balance economic development in the Russian Arctic with strategic and security and other aims. The discussion is interesting, but I felt that there is one key element, or one key factor actually missing from the equation, and that is the question of sustainability. We know that during the command economy in the Soviet Union, it was possible to pour money, resources, all kinds of decrees, ordering development in the Arctic, or in the Russian Arctic. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was obvious for everybody that most of it was non-sustainable. It was negative value creation. Now, we don't have a command economy in Russia these days, but there are some elements, some vestiges of the old system still apparent. I think a key element in the development is whether or not let's say, the emphasis on diverting resources to the development in the Arctic is sustainable. You raised the question of, or you mentioned the discussion about development, whether it's overdevelopment or underdevelopment. And my conclusion is at least that the Russian Arctic is definitely overdeveloped in the sense that there are questions about the sustainability in the long sense. And I'm especially a bit concerned about the future of the communities dependent on the LNG production facilities, which might be especially vulnerable in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Big question. Ingrid, do you have a comment to that?
It is a big question, and I can't pretend to have an answer. Well, sustainability is interesting there because sustainability of what in relation to what? When it comes to, for example, local communities, other research has shown how some communities latch on to a petroleum development, and at least in the shorter term, they can have some benefits from it. But then in the longer term, it still remains for those communities and for others which are more negatively affected by the hydrocarbon industry. It is an open question because the emphasis on developing these regions or these communities as serving the hydrocarbon industry means that they are not necessarily viable even, or at least not sustainable in the face of, for example, a less carbon-dependent international economy, but also in before that's not necessarily going to happen in the next decade, but as priorities might turn elsewhere, they might sort of be left in a more modern state, but still without a sort of a purpose and without those economic that economic basis to their actual further development. So that you're certainly pointing towards a dilemma. And one thing that I could have mentioned was that there is no clear and actually an absence of policy on climate change in Russia. But at one thing is the global level and addressing the challenge, but there is also a lack of response towards all the effects that might be visible within a few years or that are already present in diverse regions. And of course, as we now know, that affects the Arctic above all. So you're raising the issue. I think more people than I would have to bring their minds together to actually answer the full question.
Do I see? I think I'd just like to ask Janis to comment a little bit on the side here. You said that direct investment was the most disappointing part of the Russian-Chinese economic cooperation or transactions. When you talk about investments from China, you said there are hurdles, but could it also be that the Chinese have another sort of understanding of the long-term profitability of investments, a little bit along the line that was suggested here, that they are not so optimistic about the profitability of investments?
Yes, yeah, I mean, of course, the general trajectory of Russia's economy, as I said, most institutes at the moment expect that we have a long-term stagnation of about 1% growth. It's not a very attractive market to be in over the next years, and this plays a crucial role. And as you correctly point out, for Chinese businesses, they mostly follow this business logic, except for some select state companies, and this obviously plays a huge role. And of course, this is explanation why most of Chinese investment in Russia has been focused on just two particular sectors. The first one is just the natural resources, where Russia has to offer something. The second one is agriculture, and maybe one where China, would be willing to invest, but where Russia will never allow it is with regard to the defense sector, because Russia has something to offer there as well. But this is of course, a very specific industry, and it's of course all in the hands of the state in Russia.
Yes, but in terms of an Arctic development, we're talking about resource exploitation, resource projects.
Yeah.
So that is the sort of the kind of projects that are relevant in the Arctic.
Exactly. Also, you're referring to the Arctic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you can actually say that with regards to Yamal LNG, there were two very important investments from the Silk Road Fund on the one hand, and Chinese energy state company on the other hand, which sort of compensated for the lack of Western investment, which had to do with the sanctions. So there was it's one of the few cases where you can actually say that China, in a way, very clearly replaced something that was missing from the West. So yes, it plays a role, obviously, but I would still say that the preferred form of delivery of natural gas for China is not LNG, but pipeline gas, because it comes with a much longer-term commitment. So the power of Siberia, of course, it competes with Russian LNG exports. LNG exports are always flexible, can go anywhere in the world to other Asian partners. With the power of Siberia, Russia has committed itself for the next decades to export significant amounts of its natural gas to China. So this is always, the preferred mode. But yes, especially if this is a project which is tied to an individual, I mean, it's a private company, Novatek, but Timchenko is someone who's perceived to be close to Vladimir Putin. If it's this kind of project, then Russian state companies are going to be willing to invest both as a political gesture and to secure equity in Russian resources, which was, by the way, not possible before this shift in the Russian policy towards China a couple of years ago, after following the Crimea annexation. Only after that, natural resources investments in Russia were opened up for Chinese equity participation.
Do I see any other in the audience here? Are you so hungry? You just want to go for lunch? Yes, please.
I'm from the University of Offshore. Let me just contribute with one question to Jannis Kluge. Let me try and tie the two of you, the Optal contribution and your own, with a question which is obviously important, but where I expect that your answer will be no. The question is simply linking the two, China's interest in natural resources from Russia and Russia's interest in developing the northern region, the Arctic region. Is there any talk in Russia, obviously, or perhaps, but also in China, about future possibilities of China contributing to the development in the north, in the Arctic region? I know, and you presented the facts, the oil price is going to be higher if that is a viable prospect. But China is very interested, very preoccupied with energy security. And under certain scenarios, including, of course, a real breakdown in the Middle East, you could think about China becoming more interested in taking part in the north. So that's my question.
So should I answer directly, or do you want to collect?
Yeah, you can do that.
Okay, and maybe also you can join in, because I'm not really an expert on the Arctic. The role that the Arctic plays in Sino-Russian relations is also ambiguous, because on the one side there's some potential for cooperation. Obviously, China would be interested in these natural resources. If I know it correctly, but you can correct me afterwards, China is not able at the moment to replace the kind of technology which is lost due to sanctions, and which Russia would need to develop, these really complex new deposits. I would say it's ambiguous because there was at least some irritation in Russia about China, for example, calling the Northern Sea Road the Polar Silk Road. It's kind of claiming that it has kind of integrating it in the Belt and Road Initiative as one of the passages, and that China declared itself as a near Arctic country in 2017. So this is, of course, has been not very well received in Moscow, which for obvious reasons claims that this is more of an exclusive project, and it should, the term Northern Sea Route should be used, and it should be this Russian brand which is in the front. But so you can see on the one hand, there's of course potential for cooperation. On the other hand, as in many other spheres as well, you can look in Central Asia, wherever China seems to be a bit too expansive in their conquering new regions of the world where Russia has its own sensitivities. Moscow is really not a fan, or will be very careful with these initiatives, and will tend to just slow down cooperation if it appears, and kind of dilute movement, dilute the moment, the movement in these areas, and try to make the projects more complex just to slow it down. So this is kind of the response to what is perceived sometimes from the Russian side as a bit too aggressive economic expansion by China.
Yeah, and I can fill in a little. It's proven rather complex, even with the Chinese investment in Yamal LNG, to actually attract the Chinese investors, as you said, to the projects where Russia would be most interested in having that sort of investment. And some of this is due to a certain wariness. I mean, China prefers pipeline gas. Russia has pipeline gas to deliver, but it is costly to construct and bring the pipelines forward. And the experience with having the pipelines to Europe is now sometimes seen as a sort of an experience of being too dependent on one market, and the desire to avoid coming into a similar situation with China is there's a perceived need, there's a need of balancing that with, of course, competing with Central Asian gas. So you want to secure a good fat chunk of a Chinese market, but you know that there are some potential costs and some mutual dependencies that might not be to your advantage a bit further on. And of course, LNG would then be a perfect solution for the Russians, but it's not totally what the Chinese want, and it's risky, it's costly, and the Russians, Russia has also set limitations on foreign investment in actually booking reserves, for example, which would matter to any investor, which is also an oil and gas producing company. So it's a very difficult game, if looking at it as a game, to move forward, to actually make some progress in. It's very complicated negotiation, and it's actually, attaining anything at all is actually quite good, but it doesn't mean that that it's going to develop in the same speed over the next decade as it then began to do from 2015 onwards.
Mark? This Mark Galeotti.
Thank you. Mark Galeotti. Murmansk. So there is this model of the Varyag from Moscow breezing in and kicking out all the representatives of the local interests. On the one level, one might presume that actually that makes his or her life easier, not being able to operate with, constrained by all these local self-interests. But on the other hand, there is the fact that therefore the potential doesn't have local connections, knowledge, and may even face a degree of quiet resistance and backtalk or whatever. So, I mean, anyway, this is what I'm saying, is do you get that sense that actually Murmansk, as a case study, is better managed if you bring in the local interests, knowing full well that they are deeply corrupt and self-interested?
Your words,
or
not
is
mine.
It best to actually keep them out?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And that's why also when Marina Kovtun came into the picture, she was sort of picked up from lower level of an elite. I wasn't even aware of her. And then suddenly she was sort of, she skyrocketed up and became governor. The reason for that was that she had the right loyalty to her company, also her right loyalty to the Federation and United Russia, but sort of importantly, she could sort of manage the regional elites, like she knew the regional elites in addition to her sort of obligations to the Federation and the sort of the higher power system. So that's that's what I'm sort of curious to see with the new guy, with Andrej Čibis, because he is now flown in, like the second proper flat-out Variag, no connection. Sort of, I have to moderate though, with the first Variag, Dmitrienko, had spent years apparently in Murmansk in the Northern Fleet and allegedly doing business there later. So, you know, that's a different story. But so Čibis, he has been flown in, and the big question is, will he actually manage to sort of impose his order on things, whilst at the same time playing these regional elites in a proper, including them as he must in some situations, while not letting them dominate him and sort of throw away his own agenda. That's the interesting topic. You can't sort of run the region based on regional elites only and never mind the Federation and Moscow and what Moscow wants. That's impossible. You'll be thrown out, obviously. And the other way as well, you can't come there from Moscow. You know, you can be as good at your job as, you know, anyone, but without being able to cooperate and manage and, how do you say, to be the mediator between these interests that are in the region, and they're not going away. They're not awfully apparent in Čibis's government now, but they're still present in the region, and he will have to manage them. And I'm really curious to see how he performs when it comes to that. That's what will determine whether his period in office will be a success or not, whether he'll actually manage to do anything, whether he'll manage to improve the economy. You can't do that without the regional elites on board.
That was a head scratcher there, but yeah, please.
Morten Gento from Norwegian Radio and TV. Just following up a little bit about Murmansk, which is for me also a very interesting area. Could you say anything about the elite in Murmansk and their relation with Norway? Has that played any role in the changing of guards in Murmansk? Because when you have followed the press in Murmansk, there has been some critics against some of the governors. They have been too close to Norway, and therefore we have to remove them, actually. Have you studied this a little bit, or can you say anything more about that?
Well, you're obviously referring to Yuri Evdokimov. That was one of the things, yeah. Komarov as well. Yeah, less in his case, I would say. The thing is, yeah, with, I mean, because he was pretty fair and square removed with an election in the regional, sort of the first open regional election. So in Komarov, I'm not really quite buying into that. And also with Yevdokimov later, there was definitely a narrative that he was being too close to Norway and Scandinavian countries in general, and he was selling the region to Scandinavia. That was sort of, there were such reports. But honestly, I think that was just sort of window dressing. I honestly don't think that was the reason why he had to go in the end. It could have been sort of yet another sort of negative narrative that was existing around the time. But he had grown very powerful, and he had run the region for a very long time, and with a sort of smaller and smaller group of people close to him. According to himself, there were lots of oligarchic interests involved in the elite, but he was, of course, above them and wasn't sort of, leaning towards any direction. But I think it was his time to go for many reasons, but most of all because he went directly against the word of Moscow and United Russia. I think that was the reason he had to go, and his sort of good relations with Norway wouldn't have mattered. Like, that wouldn't have mattered at all had he done as he was instructed, and had he at least listened to what was said in Moscow. And yeah, he was very freely spoken, so he was very, very clear in the media about that Moscow was wrong in certain instances, and they didn't know the region very well, and he was going to run it in a different way than they wanted. And that's why he had to go, not because of us.
Let's just have a comment from the former Consul General in Murmansk.
Thank you. Yes, as you said, the former Consul General in Murmansk. I was there in the middle 90s, and I remember very well the elections in November 1995. The reason why Komarov had to go was not that somebody in Moscow felt that he should be replaced by someone else, but there was a very close election, one of the freest and fairest elections you have had in that area. And both the candidates, main candidates, Komarov and Yevdokimov, got more than 43% of the votes. But there was a very marginal small difference, so Yevdokimov won. But it's quite true that there were some misgivings among the elites in Murmansk over what somebody saw as the undue attempts to influence the election from certain political let's say, elements in Norway, in Finnmark, who are too close to Komarov, and expressed the preference that he should be re-elected. Now, I remember that very well because I had to go a few rounds with Yevdokimov and convince him that this was not the intention of the Norwegian government. Those were just expressions from various persons, from their own private opinions, and they were, of course, allowed to do that. But from the Norwegian government side, there was no preference given to one or the other candidate. And I think he bought my explanation, after a while anyway. Thank you.
Oh, interesting piece of historical information. We are approaching the end of this session, so if you have comments or questions, yes, up there, please, in the middle. Please be brief in your questions.
So, hello, my name is Louis. I am a student at the University of Oslo and also the delegate in Norway for the youth component of the French Institute of Higher National Defense Studies. So, is the link between heads of Russian companies and the top of the administration a kind of economic intelligence tool which will be a key part of the Russian strategic thinking regarding Russia's economic development within and outside of its borders? Thank you.
Whom are you addressing? Okay.
So you, if I understand the question correctly, it was about how informal, or at least relations between the top company heads and the top leadership, whether they form a part in strategic planning or development of policy, also when it comes to foreign policy, if that's, or was foreign policy in there? Yeah, okay. The book is coming later this spring. So there will be a book launch, and I hope you can make it. But what I really would like to emphasize, if I address that question first, is that it depends on foreign policy is not a big foreign policy with a big F and a big P here. It really matters a lot which relations come into play. And I also would like to emphasize that within the big, broad foreign policy lines, what happens with companies, and of course much more, particularly with the really large and powerful ones, and very rarely with others, is that they make themselves useful to the state. So they can offer up some sort of operation as a sort of a, well, you know, when heads of state or government ministers travel abroad, they always bring a delegation of people from different relevant industries. And in that context, particularly, but also when it comes to, you know, Russian companies investing abroad or other companies investing in Russia, these are the economic relations that exist, at least a substantial part of them. And in that context, in which Russia is, well, it's Russia, of course, but it's very similar to many other countries. It may, and at some points with some countries, it happens that the companies make themselves more useful, and you get these type of, and the classic example here is, of course, Ukraine before 2014, where you have this sort of package deals, where some economic relations are so important to another country that you can use them as carrots or sticks. But Ukraine is a very special country in relation to Russia, also in that sense. So it is very difficult on the basis of Ukraine and a few other countries to generalize, but that it happens is so much we can say. And outside the parameters of the former Soviet Union, it's very difficult to know, to actually know whether it happens. And it's more difficult to know now that when the sort of circle of policy making is narrow than it is in other cases. So sometimes you can infer that something is happening, but you can't really know. And that's my answer in general. But that it happens in certain cases, yes. And there's a book there coming, yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we are coming to an end, unless you have something very important to say at the end, Janis, or
No,
Ingvild?
we can
No?
have Ingrid have the last word, yeah.
You all want to have some lunch, which will be served downstairs. We hope that you can be brief. Here, it's been here. Oh, it's coming up here. Oh, yes. And we will come back to the last session at 10 minutes past 1. So then you should have swallowed the food and drunk up your coffee. Thank you very much for your attention. Yes.
Ferdig, så bare kommer jeg opp, og så skal jeg bare si takk for at jeg kom. Og sånt.
Ja.
If you would please settle down for the final session. I hope you all enjoyed lunch and did not soil your outfits with a chicken curry. My name is Håvard Bekken. I'm a senior researcher at the IFS. I will chair this last panel. To keep most of us here as long as possible, the organizers saved the real treat for the final session, namely a small but very promising panel on what Galeotti would call the murky aspects of Russian political life. The informal actors defined here, I think, we should say by their informal status, but also by their relations with the Kremlin. Sometimes, or quite often, I would say, Russia today is referred to as an autocracy, but it is also sometimes referred to as an adhocracy because of exactly this pragmatism, improvisation, ad hoc solutions, and reliance on informal actors in various schemes and in various ways. So first, we will hear from Jardar Østbø. You know him already as an assistant professor at IFS and as the big boss of the RUSECOPOL project. He's an area specialist. His research interests are pretty wide within the topic of Russia and also Albania. And he has been publishing in the Russia-related leading academic journals. Within the RUSECOPOL project, his focus is on power relations and foreign policy. And today he will discuss the role of informal actors in Russia's engagement in Africa. Jardar, please take my place.
Thank you. Thank you also for referring to me as the big boss. So, in 2013, two prominent Russian academics and former diplomats predicted a full-scale Russian return to Africa towards the end of the decade. Now, this decade has officially ended, and Russia is officially back in Africa. Last October, President Putin welcomed 43 African heads of state to the lavish Russia-Africa summit in Sochi, the first of its kind and incredibly expensive. In his welcoming speech, Putin stated that cooperation with Africa is one of the priorities of Russian foreign policy. So why should that be so? Well, the Soviet Union's relations with African countries were extensive, hence there's a sense that Russia has already invested an enormous amount of money in Africa. It just goes a bit back in time, and now, if ever, there's the time to reap some of the benefits. Russia is also, as many other countries, is also in critical need of some minerals that are found in Africa, or mostly in Africa, or even only in Africa. According to some sources, the highest leadership gave orders to cover up this lost ground and place people in strategic locations. Africa is also presented as the continent of the future, where there's a huge profit potential, immense natural resources up for grabs for those who can handle the local conditions. African countries also represent 54 votes in the UN General Assembly, as well as many votes in other UN and international bodies. It's increasingly important for Russia to have a great power status. Internationally, sanctions also mean that Russia has to look beyond the West for trade opportunities and political alliances. And the Russian foreign policy establishment is in favor of a multipolar world order where Russia is one of the undisputed leaders. Finally, but very importantly, Africa is a place where Russia can show defiance against the West by supporting incumbent authoritarians, sometimes even dictators that face the hard conditions of the Western-dominated liberal or Western-dominated international structures. Conditions such as demands for democratization or neoliberal economic reforms. So in international relations, Russia is perhaps even increasingly presenting itself as the defender of state sovereignty. So these last 2 points are arguably the most important. Russian trade with Africa is very small. In 2018, it was $20 billion, which is not very impressive when compared to the European Union's 334 billion, China's 204 billion, and even Turkey's 30 billion. Now, 30 African countries have so-called military technical agreements with Russia, but so do even some NATO members due to their continued use of Russian-produced arms. Russia is Africa's biggest supplier of weapons, but 80% of this export, of our Russia's arm exports to Africa, goes to one country, namely its longtime partner, Algeria. But in addition to this, Russian non-state actors can also offer informal services to African states outside, obviously, official channels, and these are of relatively low cost to Russia, also to the recipients, and often, not always, but very often, come in addition to official support. And I would argue that the political significance of these so-called services is high. Often, these services are associated with the infamous businessman Yevgeny Prigozhin, also known as Putin's cook. According to a source of a Russian investigative journalistic outfit, Prigozhin in 2017 was able to pitch the idea of increasing Russian influence in the third world at the expense of China. So, who is this mythical Prigozhin? Well, St. Petersburg native, spent most of the 1980s in prison for theft, robberies, and fraud. In the early 90s, after a stint as a hot dog vendor, he went into St. Petersburg restaurant business, allegedly under the wings of organized crime. As a restaurateur, he was now able to make local political connections, and thereby he gained possibility to host important events. Later years, his company has secured near monopolistic catering contracts for the Russian army, also for the school system in Russia, primary schools. He was indicted by the US authorities in 2018 for his role in the alleged meddling in the presidential election through the infamous so-called troll factory that used a network of fake social media accounts to spread divisive messages. Prigozhin is widely regarded as a patron of the private military and security company known under the name Wagner. Some sources claim that it was actually the Russian General Staff's idea to establish a private military company for certain tasks back in 2013. Prigozhin was selected for the task. Reports have it that he wasn't overjoyed, but it was an offer he couldn't refuse. If this version is correct, it's a good example of how patron-client relations work. Prigozhin has many powerful enemies. He has several criminal and administrative investigations hanging over his head, just waiting to be activated. Nor is he particularly close to Putin, contrary to what is often claimed in Western media. But by being useful to the state, he has at least so far been able to get away with a lot of things. Now, after initial success and then failure in Syria, Wagner forces have become more and more important in Africa. In what is seen as a leaked internal document of Prigozhin's company, 39 African states are listed as countries of interest to him. These structures, allegedly under Prigozhin's control, provide African rulers with what we can call an informal sovereignty package. There's private security forces and political consultants or political technologists are more often called in the Russian context, implying a more active role than the mere consultancy. So in return for this package, the structures typically request access to natural resources, for instance, gold, diamonds. The political technologists are or have been active in 20 African countries, according to the aforementioned leaked internal documents. And an independent TV channel last year estimated that between 100 and 200 of Prigozhin's political consultants were working at the time in African countries. As a rule, they offer political advice to the incumbent leadership, however authoritarian and dictatorial, as long as they stay in power. They, for example, developed a strategy to help Sudan's Omar al-Bashir, who faced international charges of genocide and crimes against humanity, to regain control when he was challenged by a domestic protest movement. The strategy, which was leaked, obtained by the press, elaborated on, among other things, how to smear the opposition and suppress the protests with, quote-unquote, minimal but acceptable loss of lives. Wagner forces were also deployed to back up Bashir militarily. But when the dictator was deposed in April 2019, relations continued under Sudan's Military Transitional Council. In the neighboring Central African Republic, Russia has, following the assessments of Prigozhin Company, considerable influence. Officially in 2018, Russia secured a UN mandate to provide 150 civilian and 5 military instructors, as well as an exemption from the arms embargo to supply some light weaponry to the country's military forces. France had then withdrawn its military forces from the former colony a year before. But Russian non-state actors are more deeply involved. Valery Zakharov, a Russian former police officer, and according to media investigations, what could be classified as a Wagner employee, is the President Tuadera's security advisor. And Wagner forces serve as security detail to the president. They're also reported to be training local forces, and then they're thus blurring the boundary between themselves and the official UN-sanctioned Russian training mission. Wagner forces are said to operate 4 airfields in the country, including the runway built at the deserted residence of the former president, where they have set up camp. When a Russian brokered peace agreement between the government and various, like a dozen rebel groups in Central Africa was signed in 2019, a source from Prigozhin's circle hinted that he had played a role, although he had not participated in the official meetings. So the price for these services seemed to have been that a company called Lobaye Invest, credibly linked to Prigozhin, has been granted extensive mining concessions for diamonds, with which the country abounds. In Libya, as another example, official Russia plays the role of a peace broker between the UN-supported government and the main rebel commander, General Haftar. However, Haftar has also previously been visiting Russia on his own, and famously, Prigozhin was spotted at the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu's talks with Haftar in November 2018. Wagner forces are reported to be fighting on the side of General Haftar in his efforts to overthrow the UN-recognized Libyan government, who claimed that they could document the presence of up to 800 Wagner personnel in the country. Smaller deployments of Wagner have been reported in a number of other African countries as well. So since private military companies still are illegal in Russia, the Wagner Group finds itself in a legal gray zone at best. It can be regarded, or some regard them, as a tool for Russia to pursue foreign policy objectives outside formal channels. At the same time, they're normally independent. Some sources claim that there is no doubt that Prigozhin's actions in foreign policy were agreed to by the highest leadership, and that there is also coordination with the on a lower level with the Ministry of Affairs Department of Africa. But Russian officials vehemently deny any involvement by the state in these ventures. The president's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, has stated that Vladimir Putin does not know about Prigozhin's activity in Africa, and the foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, has said that she didn't know anything about it. So the semi-legal status signals to foreign heads of states, even warlords, that Russia, as a wider entity, has several levers to pull. The criminal image of Prigozhin himself, his alleged role in the meddling in the US elections, his role in supporting authoritarians and dictators, send a powerful signal that he does not abide by the rules of civilized society. Russia does not have the economic clout of the US or China, but Russian non-state actors offer tools for African incumbents to strengthen their sovereignty. By contrast to Western aid and support from international organizations such as the International Monetary Fund, whose loans depend on economic deregulation, democratic reform, Russian investments and support come with no strings attached, at least no visible ones. Hence, Russia is attractive for the regimes and national elites whose privileges could be threatened by the political and economic reforms required by the Western and international structures. For some, it could also be an opportunity to provide a counterweight, however small, to the massive Chinese involvement on the continent. Anton Morozov, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the State Duma, stated during the Sochi Russian-Africa Summit, quote, "Our policies never aim to impose our cultural values, our democracy standards, and so on. We always respect the sovereignty of our partners. So in that sense, it's much more beneficial for the African countries to cooperate with Russia than other countries, including Western states," unquote. So in a sense, while the West can offer democratic submission, Russia offers sovereignty, uses it as a strategic resource. In return for this sovereignty package, it gets foothold in strategically important countries with abundant natural resources. It also demonstrates defiance against the West, presenting itself as an alternative. The high price, however, for Russia, we can say, is that part of these efforts to gain a status as a global great power, in a sense, depend on a criminal former hot dog vendor. Thank you.
Thank you, Yardar. Second, I will call Mark Galeotti to the podium, leading expert in Russian politics and security, honorary professor at UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and a senior non-resident fellow at the Institute of International Relations Prague, among other things. He is the author of a great many books, articles, and tons of commentaries. He got his own blog, In Moscow Shadows. And he always has a personal take on recent events in Russia. Among Galeotti's most recent books is We Need to Talk About Putin, which will be a subject of discussion tomorrow morning at NUPI. Another recent book is called Vori, the Russian super mafia, translated also into Norwegian last year. Mark Galeotti will share now his insight on a theme related to this second book, namely that of Russian organized crime and its relation to the Kremlin policy, home and abroad. Please.
Well, it's great to be back in Oslo. Thank you very much, obviously, for the invitation. Not thank you quite so much for being the very last person in the program when you're all thinking, can't we go home yet? September 2014, an Estonian security officer from Kapo, their security police, Eston Kohver, was meeting a supposed informant close to the border with Russia. It was a fairly routine operation. He had backup, but basically he was there on his own. as he approached the meeting place, suddenly a snatch squad from the Russian Federal Security Service's Alpha counterterrorism commandos stormed across the border, jammed his communications. They used stun grenades to keep his backup at bay, while they grabbed Kochver and brought him back across the border into Russia. In due course, he would be tried as an Estonian spy. After all, Russia has so much to fear from the dreaded Estonians. And sentenced to 15 years in prison, though he was then, shortly thereafter, released in a spy swap. Why? Kochver was not investigating some high security operation. He was investigating some cigarette smugglers who were taking counterfeit and untaxed cigarettes across the border and selling them in much more highly taxed Europe. Why on earth would this be worth an international incident and the deployment on, let's be honest, NATO soil of Russian military personnel? Well, as the investigation continued, it became clear that yes, this was just simply a cigarette smuggling outfit, largely of Russian-speaking Estonians. However, it was essentially being given a free pass across the border by the Russian Federal Security Service that also control the Russian border guards. In return for which, it was carrying out some very low-level intelligence surveillance. More importantly, it was, in effect, being taxed. A share of its profits from its sales of these cigarettes in Europe was being expected to be deposited in particular bank accounts, generating what in the Russian terms is chornaya kassa, black account monies, that seems to have no kind of Kremlin fingerprints on it, really as a way of generating operational funds for intelligence operations widely conceptualized within Europe. And I think this is a particular high-profile case of something that we are beginning to see, still in a very relatively small number of cases, but nonetheless, the mobilization of Russian-based organized crime networks outside, particularly in Europe, as an instrument of Russian statecraft. Most recently, for example, at the end of last year, there was a Chechen by the name of Khangoshvili who was gunned down in Berlin by a man who turns out to be a Russian gangster. But a Russian gangster who had managed to get his Schengen visa, courtesy of a whole suite of fake documents, a fake identity, essentially, assembled by exactly the same department within the Russian Interior Ministry that also provided the false documents for the Russians who went to try and assassinate GRU officer turned British spy Sergei Skripal in Britain. And a gangster who at one point had actually been wanted by the Russian state, to the point where they'd actually put out an Interpol red notice for him. And then, just as quickly, the Russian state decided not only were they no longer interested in him, but they would scrub almost every reference to him out of their official databases. Now, we can assume, rather than know, but that some kind of a deal was made. And we have a series of other cases. Killings here, low-level surveillance there, above more than anything else, essentially expecting payments to be made to raise these chornaya kassa funds. But it is a growing, small-scale phenomenon. And really it comes out of the confluence of two specific processes, one long-term, one short-term. The long-term one is precisely the relationship of the Russian state, something that predates 1991, indeed arguably predates 1917, of the Russian state and particularly its intelligence apparatus with gangsters. I'm not going to give you the full prehistory. You'll find that in my book. But suffice to say that certainly, if one looks at the Soviet era, anyone who's read Gulag memoirs will realize the extent to which actually the Soviet state co-opted professional criminals to be their kind of foremen and enforcers to keep the political prisoners in line. More recently, in the 1970s and 1980s, you had a lot of the hard currency speculators, money changers, black marketeers, who hung around Western tourists, particularly obviously in Moscow and Leningrad, were actually recruited by the KGB as informants. They could continue their activities so long as they also passed information back to the KGB. Since 1991, we've again seen this alliance. Now look, there is sometimes this term used of Russia as a mafia state. I really dislike and find unhelpful that particular formulation, because it implies either the gangsters run the Kremlin or the Kremlin runs organized crime. Neither of that is true. There are obviously massive levels of corruption and embezzlement at the top level of the Russian system. And there are also relationships and understandings and deals. But it is not actually that this is a sort of a single organizational structure. Instead, what it reflects is the fact that the Russian state has basically taken it upon itself to set a series of parameters for how organized crime can operate. And as I said, this was until recently essentially proscriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, it was don't do these things or there will be trouble, rather than we'd like you to do this. And that's the change between those two is an important one that I'll come to in a minute. And in some ways, this shouldn't surprise us, because in hindsight, this is precisely what happened in St. Petersburg during the tenure as deputy mayor of, at the time, a rather unknown individual, Vladimir Putin, who was essentially the liaison guy at the mayor's office, and therefore he liaised with whoever needed to be liaised with, whether we're talking foreign businesses or domestic businesses, or indeed whether we're talking organized crime, particularly Tambovskaya, which is the largest organized crime grouping within St. Petersburg, and one that still survives to this day, although it doesn't really use that name anymore. And the pattern that emerged was this. The gangsters could operate. It doesn't mean to say that the police wouldn't try and catch them or whatever, but in a way that the state apparatus, in this case the mayor's office, wouldn't really go seriously after them, so long as, in effect, they helped keep the city running. And this was the 1990s. This is where actually politics was often precisely a matter of not just personal enrichment, but also collective survival. And in this case, it made sense. And the interesting thing that when Putin came to the presidency, there was a great uncertainty. He talked very tough about law and order. I remember one professional criminal whom I talked to said that at that time he slept with a packed suitcase under his bed. So just in case one of his informants in the local police told him that they were going to come to arrest him, he could grab that suitcase and make for the airport and get out. He never had to use that suitcase. It became very clear that Putin's tough law and order rhetoric did not actually extend to organized crime. Again, I don't think it's that he thinks that gangsters are nice people or anything like that. I just think he doesn't regard it as a strategic priority. And let's face it, dealing with organized crime seriously on a national level would require that kind of strategic priority. Instead, what in effect he offered organized crime nationally was what he had offered organized crime in St. Petersburg, which is a social contract, which essentially can be boiled down to this. You will carry on trying to commit your crimes, and the police and the prosecutors will continue trying to catch you. That game will continue. However, if you do anything that looks like a direct challenge to the state, anything that embarrasses the state, anything that gets in the way of state priorities, we will treat you as an enemy of the state, which is a much, much more uncomfortable position to be in. And on the whole, this was a social contract that most organized crime groups, and above all the lords in charge of them, were willing to accept. They'd had 10 years of turf wars, of killings and so forth. They'd established their pecking orders. They were now happy just to sit back and enjoy. And Putin was basically giving them the opportunity to do that. And this was every now and then policed with a very high-profile seizure of some gangster who was regarded as having transgressed. 2007, for example, Barsukov also went by the name of Kumarin, who was actually the leading light within Tambovskaya, and who clearly was not with the program. He was living too high-profile a life, and that was a bit embarrassing. He got into business disputes with people who were that much closer to the Kremlin than he was. You know, he hadn't moved with the times. 150 police commandos were airlifted to St. Petersburg to storm his home, supported by armored personnel carriers. He was grabbed, again, taken back to Moscow for trial, and in due course was convicted. Did they need 150 police commandos? Of course not. This was about theatre. This is about making a point that the state is, if need be, the biggest gang in town. That you may have lots of guys with lots of guns, but we have more guys with bigger guns. So every now and then, you find it also with, for example, the mayor of Makhachkala, who was also arrested in a similarly high-profile way. Every now and then, just to keep people sort of aware of the relationship, this was done. But as I said, this was largely prescriptive. The Chechen Bratva, the Chechen sort of criminal diaspora, was warned, don't get involved in supporting your cousins back home during the Second Chechen War, or else. They decided, on the whole, fair enough. More recently, with both the Sochi Winter Olympics and the World Cup, it was very clear there was a big charm offensive. They wanted all the foreign visitors to have a good time, so the word went out. That basically lay off them. If you're going to sell them drugs, make sure you sell them the drugs that you promise. Don't roll them and so forth. There was one particular guy in Moscow who ran a pickpocketing ring, who was brought in by the police. They picked him up and they said, this will be a good month for you and your guys to go on holiday. They went on holiday. But this last point, the extent to which actually this has moved beyond just simply a don't do this to a do that. And really what it reflects is the realities of the international situation since 2014. Russia regards itself, and we can debate the rights and the wrongs, but essentially to be fighting an existential political struggle for its sovereignty, for its position in the world, and for its unique cultural and political life. Against a West which it understands is vastly more powerful on almost every single objective index of power. I mean, European NATO has more troops than Russia, even without having to count a single American or Canadian, let alone the economic disparities. And as a result, we have the adoption of, I hate this term, hybrid war, asymmetric tactics, whatever, guerrilla geopolitics, whereby the Russians seek to move the center of conflict to the areas where they feel that they are strongest, or at least that the West is weakest. But also a mobilization state. Russia is not Stalinism, it's not North Korea, it is actually a country which still has terribly sort of vibrant independence within business, within civil society, and so forth. However, the Kremlin has decided that precisely because this is an existential struggle, in effect, the model of conscription can be applied. Everyone, every institution, any company, or indeed any criminal gang can at some point be metaphorically tapped on the shoulder and said, we need you to do this for the motherland. And again, if we're talking about offers you can't refuse, this is a request you can't refuse. Because obviously to say no characterizes you as opposed to the motherland. And so this is what we're beginning to see. And as I said, I really want to keep this in context. I do not want to suggest that every Russian gangster is a sort of an auxiliary of the Russian intelligence state. Absolutely not. Any more than every Russian businessman is part of some kind of nefarious Kremlin scheme. The problem is, though, particularly for groups which essentially have their center of gravity still within Russia or depend on goods and services that are trafficked through Russia, in other words, anyone that, if need be, the Kremlin can lean on, any one of those can be activated. It's, for the Russian intelligence community, the gangsters are generally the last resort. They don't trust them, they're not professional, they're not efficient, you don't necessarily have the same security. But at times, the regulars are overstretched, or the gangsters have a particular skill or access. For example, there was a case of a Russian spy, one of the so-called illegals program in America, who had made it to Cyprus and then disappeared off the radar. People who know much more about this than me have suggested that actually it was a people trafficker. In other words, someone who was particularly skilled in getting people across borders without anyone knowing, who got him to Greece. And then, because Greece is basically a Russian intelligence playground, then, as it were, the Russian professionals took him over. So, in conclusion, what we have is a long tradition of the state suborning individual gangsters and individual gangs, usually for just very, very specific minor purposes, which has been rather turbocharged of late by the needs of the current Kremlin in fighting this, as I said, political war against the West, to basically be looking to any institutions that might help. And the particular concern for mine is this business of Chornaya Kassa monies. We're worried about disinformation. We're worried about destabilization and subversion. Now, that's not something the Kremlin can do directly itself. It's fairly obvious if all of a sudden the Kremlin starts writing checks to people. But on the other hand, by generating money, which can support all kinds of divisive activities, operations, and groups and individuals in the West, it actually does give the Kremlin opportunity to mess with us in a way that alarms me. I shall end there on that uplifting note.
Please both take your chairs. So by now you know the drill. We'll have a Q&A session and we'll have the mic passed around. I think we will also ask for you still to keep your questions brief and on topic. Just please give me a signal. Okay, so when you're thinking about it a bit, I can start with my question on myself then. What is interesting in all the academic topics, but I think especially interesting when we're discussing informal politics is, of course, the issue of methodology. So my question to you both concern how do you find information, how do you verify this information, what are your sources when you're in this project or in earlier projects approach these murky aspects of politics. Do you still drink with Russian criminals, Mark?
Interestingly, that happens much less these days. One is because I am sort of less young and therefore less stupid than I was. But also interestingly because I think actually talking to a Westerner has just generally become a bit more toxic, a bit more dangerous an experience since 2014. I mean, less so for people who are on the underworldy side than on the state side, but interestingly, there is a similar trajectory. I mean, these days, I find I lose more contacts than I make, in the sense of people who once upon a time would have been willing to talk to me are now much less likely to do so. So it happens much less. I mean, on this particular topic, I mean, one of the great virtues is because we're talking about essentially Russian operations in the West and above all in Europe, that actually that is where a lot of the real material is. We have court cases, and court cases are brilliant because all of a sudden it means huge amounts of documents come into public view. We also have the fact that this is an issue about which both law enforcement and also security agencies are, to an extent, willing to talk. But the final point I make is, and again, I mean, it says something about Russia and about, I think, the contrast between many people's perceptions of Russia is actually the extent to which there is striking levels of internal discussion. And sometimes you find it on weird and wonderful, or not so weird, or not so wonderful Telegram channels. Sometimes you find it on certain sort of websites and things. I mean, there is extraordinary Crime Russia and Prime Crime websites, which are more or less like, if you can imagine sports fanatics, but instead of sports teams and individuals, they follow gangsters and gangs. But there's huge amounts of discussion, and again, a lot of it is nonsense and speculation, but there's actually a lot in there, which is why it's worth mentioning Europol follow these. So, I mean, actually, the funny thing is there is a lot of knowledge. The problem, the real problem is the triangulation, is you get that one great rumor, and you think, wow, I want that to be true. And finding other ways to actually be sure that, well, hopefully be sure that it is true, rather than just simply it's just not a really great rumor.
Okay, Yadar, how do you go about opening a new field of research interest?
Yeah, well, in this line of research, I rely on open sources, media, also to a certain extent, the Telegram channels that often you find pieces of information that you want to be true, and that would really fit well in my thesis and everything, but I have to thread very carefully. I don't have or any like these several years of experience talking to such
The most polite
actors.
way of calling me old, I've heard. But yeah.
Yeah, right. But there's a striking amount of information out there. It's not a problem of lack of information. It's the abundance of information and conflicting information, and probably information that's not very neither easy to triangulate nor easy to check that particular piece of information. So one source claims that Prigozhin is governed or a tool of the Kremlin. Another source claims that he's just out making money. You can't place the truth in the exact middle between those either. So it's meticulous work, and but there's a lot of information available of different credibilities.
Okay, thank you. We have a question up there, or yeah, and one down here. We'll take both.
Thank you very much for two very interesting presentations. My name is Karen Anaigen. I'm a research fellow at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. I have three questions. First two ones are for you, Mark. One, when will you start your own podcast? Because I'm sure I'm not the only one who missed the times when you spoke on the power of vertical. The second question is if you could elaborate a bit on the intelligence services use of organized crime, and if you could say it's a means or a method to disrupt in Europe, for instance. And the third question is, would you call, as you mentioned, Gerdai, the Wagner Group, would you also categorize that as organized crime? Thank you.
Then we have Kristin Vennerudskog.
Thank you very much. My name is Kristin Brusgaard. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo. Thank you for very interesting talks. I was thinking about one concept that neither of you mentioned, but that I think probably infuses both your comments, which is deniability and the importance of deniability with regard to the Russian calculations about making use of informal actors rather than other actors or resources that are more closely associated with the Russian state. So I wondered if you would both like to comment on the issue of deniability and what the implications are with regard to this concept as it pertains to how we should be dealing with Russian policies that, for example, take place in our societies. What are the repercussions in terms of whether we should be holding Russia accountable for these activities? Thank you.
Okay, podcast. At the moment someone pays me to do it. Is the glib answer of a freelancer. No, it's something I might do at some point, but I keep meaning to. Who knows? In terms of the intelligence services' use of organised crime, though, I mean, I think it's not, I think, specifically as a sort of means of disruption. It's essentially as operational support. I mean, the big picture, in my opinion, is, you know, what is Russia's kind of strategy? Well, there is no such thing. Its approach to the West is, look, ideally it wants the West to give it what it wants, which is to recognize it as a great power, and that means, you know, because I think Putin has a very 19th century notion of what a great power is. It means sphere of influence, it means like Ukraine, it means a voice in every single sort of major international issue, and it means a sort of basically the get-out-of-jail-free card from international law from time to time. All things that, as far as he's concerned, America has got. Now, given that we're not willing to do that, I think the option is therefore to divide us, to distract us, and to demoralize us, precisely so that we're not in a position to be coherently able to resist Russia when it actually does seek to sort of assert its own interests. Now, this is much, much wider than any one particular instrument. I mean, this is the whole point. It's everything from the trolls to overt foreign policy initiatives to intelligence activities and such like. Organised crime, I think, fills a very small niche, you might say, of supporting those activities. And as I said, I think the most important one they do these days is exactly in terms of generating funds. Because that fund, I mean, you know, if you want to, I mean, I don't believe for a minute that the Russians had a crucial role in electing Trump, or even much I would love to be able to blame Putin for it, past getting the Brexit referendum sort of through. It would be so nice not to have to blame ourselves. But, you know, that would have cost millions and been really obvious. On the other hand, someone who runs some populist website, particularly pushing certain kind of divisive agenda from the bedroom in their mum's house, 10,000 euros can probably keep them sort of doing it for a whole year because it's a sort of, you know, a passion or something for them. Small amounts of money, if they can be, but the point is, you know, from the Russian point of view, the problem's always been, how do you actually transfer that money without making it really obvious? This is a way of generating that. So in a way, you can have certain sources. Certainly when I was in Prague, for example, you know, there are a couple of news outlets there that genuinely their funding streams seem very, very questionable and opaque, and their messaging does seem very, very convenient for the Russians. But we are stuck with actually having to rely on what we can prove, because that's the nature of modern law-based democratic societies. Which in a way leads me on to the whole business of deniability. I mean, Yardadar actually, as part of this project, has elaborated a very interesting paper, so I'll let him talk about sort of his aspect. But I mean, my view is that, yes, Russia often enjoys deniability. For some reason, we actually have made quite a fetish of it, in the sense of we almost feel that we need to apply juridical standards to be able to say that people, you know, we think that they did X, that we can prove it in a court of law. Well, it's not the case. You know, Pearl Harbor, no one was sitting there thinking, well, they look like Japanese planes, but can we be sure they really were? Now, after a certain point, Occam's razor has to apply. But the interesting thing about deniability is actually a lot of Russia's adventurous activities, if I can euphemize them as that, are designed to be deniable, but only up to a point. Skripal case, for me, is the best example. Look, if you just wanted to kill this ex-spy who you think is still in the game, which is my reason, you know, my opinion as to why they wanted to kill him, because they thought, in a way, he was breaking the terms of his pardon. There are much easier, cheaper, and more subtle ways. You just push him under a bus. You shoot him in what seems to be an apparent robbery, whatever. You use Novichok, weapons-grade Novichok, in other words, stuff that came recently out of a factory, not something that was made in someone's, you know, basement or shed. Because you want to be able to say, it's nothing to do with us, but with a nod, a wink, and a sly little twinkle that says, of course it was us. but you can't prove it. A lot of what Russia wants to do in this context, in my opinion, is precisely to create the sense that Russia is too dangerous, too unpredictable, too erratic, too problematic in general, and that therefore we need to strike a deal. That is, it's a kind of an upgraded version of Nixon's, lunatic school of foreign policy.
Yeah, I totally agree. Just on the Wagner Group, organized crime, well, private military companies happen to be illegal in Russia. So in that sense, it's we're talking about crime, but in the more say conventional sense, it's hard to talk about Wagner as organized crime. It was important, I think, when we discuss these issues, is not to get locked to certain concepts and impose them on the on reality. It's also with this deniability. I totally agree. I think maybe running the risk of becoming too philosophical here, that we are becoming too, so to speak, Protestant in a way. If I will go back to what I did my PhD thesis on, it was on political myths. And if you go back in the history of ideas, you will see that the Greeks accepted different levels of reality. They developed science, the ancient Greeks, of course, developed science, but at the same time they had this flourishing mythology that they sort of believed in, sort of didn't believe in, but it carried a significance in their lives. And this also goes sort of hand in hand with post-modernism. Russia, or Moscow, is in many ways the capital of postmodernism. They like narratives, they like spectacles, and it's great. Like the Skripal case, you can put on a huge spectacle, send a signal, while at the same time officially deny it, that you are behind it. So that's makes it a valuable tool. But if we're preoccupied with, of course, you can prove or disprove who did it or didn't do it, but sometimes it's only an empty shell, but it's still there. What's important is the signal they're trying to send.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions from the audience? Plenty, that's good. Okay, Groholm first, and we got another one here.
Yes, I'm Groholm from Norwegian Broadcasting. I was wondering a question about measurement. How important is groups like the Wagner Group in the Russian Africa policy? Because you don't get a sense from what you are talking about. You get a sense it's in a way impressive, but how essential is it to Russia's strategy in Africa, and also, for instance, in Syria, where they were active? And about this black Chornaya Kasa, I was wondering, at what level are the decisions taken? Who will take the decision how to spend the money, or to create a Chornaya Kasa from a particular criminal group, or to put them, to make them operatives for FSB, for instance? At what level would that be decided? And also, how important are these Chornaya Kasa for the Russian goals and aims, and for the Russian operatives on the state level in foreign countries?
We'll have another question here, right away.
Yeah, my name is Natalia Irmieva. I'm currently affiliated with the Oslo Metropolitan University. Thanks so much for a fantastic session, and I have a question to Mark Alotti. Just going through the list of your recent publications, I just get an impression of rather strong interest in Russian-Ukrainian relationships, and that's why I was wondering if you could elaborate briefly on the role of Russian organized crime in the so-called separatist republics in the eastern Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'll stick to these questions now, and I will have a final round if you've got time.
Yeah, whether Wagner is essential to Russia in Africa. Well, essential. I would say it's, in my perspective, where it's important to show Russia, or it's important for Russia to appear as an alternative, as an alternative, a new vector in the multipolar world order. Russia to appear as a great power, while at the same time not having economic or even at least conventional military resources comparable to that of say the US, that has more and more withdrawn from the continent, but still, and China, who has invested immense amounts of money. It goes often, this informal non-state element often goes hand in hand with the official initiatives, but it can go further, it can fill other tasks. It's a way of achieving things to a relatively moderate price, I would say. Yeah.
In terms of the sort of decision-making and how important gangster activity is, well, look, first of all, in terms of the importance, not very much at the moment. As I said, it's, I think it's a noteworthy phenomenon, but it's not in any way a major one. However, one of the interesting points we always have to remember is the risks of unintended consequences. At the moment, there is a sort of great effort going into identifying where Russian sort of oligarchs and minigarchs spend their money, and, as it were, the formal flows of money. Well, the more effective we are at, identifying and locating and tracking that, and therefore making it less able to be used for political purposes, actually we create an incentive for them just simply to shift to criminal money instead. Because it's either that or they just stop spending money at all in their operational uses. Where's the decision-making coming from? That's a really interesting point, and I think it speaks to, for me, one of the most fundamental issues about understanding how the Putin system works, which is actually, for me, again, we've had this term adhocracy. I mean, so much of what happens is generated from below. Putin is not this chess grandmaster who's sitting there making all the decisions and planning things umpteen steps in advance. So much of this is generated from below, from within the system. It either never gets approval at all, except within its own sort of structures, or it only sort of becomes worthy of being okayed once it's reached a certain stage and has been proven to be successful, and they're trying to say, hey, we'd like to be rewarded for this. This is actually a very, very decentralized system. So actually, I would suggest that probably what it is you have tasking that goes with intelligence agencies, FSB, Foreign Intelligence Service, GRU, and so forth. And if one of them decides, okay, well, as part of our tasking, we want to increase the amount of, just to pick an example, at random, post-Brexit secessionism within Scotland. So, okay, we want to try and encourage more talk about Scottish independence. We want to sort of make the tone of discussion more toxic than it might otherwise be, and so forth. And most of the time they're thinking, okay, well, what can be done through RT, or what can be done through disinformation or troll farms or whatever. But they might think, okay, well, we've identified a specific, again, a political group or similar that we'd like to find some way of supporting. And then they'd be thinking, okay, well, how can we do that? Now, if they have alternative means, they will do so by alternative means. If they suddenly think, though, no, we still need some money, then maybe they'll think, okay, well, who do we know? Which gangs do we know that are operating that we can squeeze for money? So it's not actually that it sits there then thinking, we will now co-opt organised crime. It's from time to time they need things doing, and they will just look at whatever instruments are at their disposal, and sometimes organised crime will be the indicated one. But again, it's a utilitarian, quite imaginative, dispersed, diffused way of generating activity. And in terms of going on to Russia and Ukraine, I mean, in a way, the separatist pseudo-states have acquired, to an extent, their own momentum, and their armed forces, however ramshackle, indisciplined, and criminalized they are, have sort of become that. But if one looks at the genesis of many of the militia units, it's clear that there were some which are basically near enough organized crime gangs, localized organized crime gangs, that found an opportunity to, in some ways, convert the will and the capacity to use violence into political and economic power. And we still see that to this day. I mean, some of the skirmishes of the ceasefire violations do not in any way appear to have been sort of instructed from Lugansk or Donetsk or Moscow or whatever. They're actually just started, they happen brushfire style, they happen there. And one of the reasons, I mean, sometimes it's just because someone thinks there's something wrong or whatever, but one of the reasons why that happens is that it's a classic tactic, that you say that the Ukrainians, and frankly it also works on the other side of the border, but primarily on this side, you say that Ukrainians tried to launch an attack, and you burnt off 20,000 rounds of ammunition doing so. You actually shot 10,000 rounds. Within a week, you'll get 20,000 new rounds, having been funneled from the sort of depots outside Rostov-on-Don and such like. And you will sell the excess 10,000. You will monetize the war for your own advantage. So there is a lot of, in a way, institutionalized criminality that is now taking place within that war. But the interesting final point I'd make is I once had a conversation with an officer from the SBU, the Ukrainian intelligence service. We know that there's huge amounts of smuggling flows that certainly used to take place through the Donbass region, particularly heroin, part of the northern route of heroin from Afghanistan. So I said to him, look, of course routes change, but in aggregate terms, has the start of the conflict in any way changed the flow of drugs? And he said, not at all. Ukrainian gangs and Russian gangs, their countries may be at undeclared war, but they are the true internationalists. They are still perfectly comfortable talking, working, and making deals and making money with each other, even while notionally the fighting goes on.
Thank you. I believe we have Ina Sangarcheva, please. Anyone else? Please give me a sign.
Thank you very much both for interesting stories about Russia. But I want to ask Mark, my question also again about society. If we go back to, if I understand correctly, if you should correct me if I'm wrong, but in the Soviet time, there was kind of different approach to KGB. It has a role and so on. And today it's different. And the society accepted, in a way, this kind of structure. How it plays now in terms of what you have been researching? Do you see the change in society? Is it supporting, do they support this kind of, I do believe that the society at large accept that things are going on, they are in elites, they are just, conflicting with each other. But how is it now? Do you have any data how the society as such, and do you see the emergence of the rule of law in a way? There is an kind of an interest to systemize, to know what is going on, and what is your perception for transformation of these kind of groups? How do you see in the nearest future? Thank you.
Thank you. This is the last chance of getting additional questions from the audience. Okay, I'd just like to add one question myself then before you answer, and also add your final comments. I wonder, or I want to go back to the elite dynamics and where we started today. We heard that many mayors, governors, others subjected to these purges are also subjected to criminal trials. And we also know that not only in this wave, but also in the previous wave, we have had an influx of technocrats, so-called, or managers, or men with square glasses. So my question is whether we can see in this development an element of anti-corruption, of an attempt to decriminalize at least part of the government structure.
Okay, so we end on the all of society and everything in 10 minutes or whatever.
We have about 5 minutes, actually.
Okay, very briefly. It's worth mentioning about transformational groups. The current, in my opinion, the current status quo within the underworld is actually relatively brittle. It's under pressure. 1990s, you had this decade of turf wars, which led to an understanding of, it led to the drawing of boundaries and pecking orders and so forth. The Putin social contract in many ways fossilized that. And that was a good thing because it reduced the amount of violence. But on the other hand, bizarrely enough, the problem is not enough gangsters are getting killed. By which I mean that actually you haven't got social mobility, and therefore there is a generation of sort of 40-somethings gangsters who are watching their 60-somethings godfathers showing no sign of retiring. Does this sound familiar? There are interesting kind of parallels between presidencies in certain systems and godfatherdoms. But, and the 40-somethings are thinking, well, when is my chance? And we've already seen that lead to certain sort of episodes of violence. Certainly, I think, were there an explosion, a serious explosion of conflicts within the underworld, I think that would very much change the whole political equation. At the moment, you might say this both social and governmental tolerance for kind of organized crime is predicated on the fact that it does not lead to real threats for ordinary people. Nowadays, when someone gets gunned down in a mob hit, basically it's always someone who's in that world anywhere, and no one cares. It gets you 2 column inches on page 6 of the Omsk Courier, and you move on. No one feels at risk the way they did in the 1990s. It doesn't mean to say that I think everyone's fine with the situation. It's just that it's just not a particularly visible one. It's not like corruption. Everyone has their own corruption stories. It doesn't matter if you're a bus driver or a professor. You experience that in a way that most people do not experience organized crime. So I think that it's in some ways it's a pending issue rather than anything else. Rule of law, I put my faith in pragmatic kleptocrats. Rule of law will probably not bubble up from the bottom, it will come from the top. It's exactly the people who currently have spent the last decade stealing with both hands and say, well, okay, I've stolen enough now, I'd like that to be legitimate. People who stole in the 1990s, who are thinking about succession themselves, again, we continue to come back to the same themes, who want to be able to hand it to their kids or whoever, but in a way that is legitimate and fixed. This is unfortunately where rule of law comes from. It comes from the interests of the wealthy. And that's why one of the reasons why I'm kind of unfashionably optimistic about Russia. And so linking that finally to this business of the sort of purge of the elites and things. Yeah, I think that, again, organized crime does not really feature in much of this. Corruption and embezzlement is different. If one looks at something like, for example, the Sochi Winter Olympics, in which organized crime clearly was involved in various making money out of everything from property deals to bring in traffic labourers to build facilities beforehand, that kind of thing. The big contracts go to the big players, and it subcontracts and subcontracts and somewhere in the chain of subcontracting, firms that are basically linked to organised crime come into it. But it's not as though the Rothenberg brothers or whoever who get the contracts then sit down with godfathers of organised crime to make deals. It happens organically in the process. Obviously, as you get to local politics, things get that much more close. The chains are much smaller when you're a mayor of some small town or something like that. But I think there is a certain awareness that organised crime is not just politically toxic, but also economically counterproductive in many ways. When one saw anything like a real fight back against organised crime in Italy, it required three things: proper laws on the books that actually will allow the state to do it, law enforcement structures willing and able to do the job, and a political elite that was forced by public opinion to unleash the law enforcers to use the laws. Now, Russia actually, it has the right laws, in the main. I mean, there are problems, but it has them there. It actually has a law enforcement community which, in my opinion, there is a large number of people who do want to do the job. The problem is the mechanisms of how you actually get the elite to unleash them. In the absence of working democracy, it's going to have to come from the self-interest of the elite to do that.
Thank you. I think we need to give the last couple of minutes to Jardar.
Just to add, fully agree again, but I think we all can see that there is a recognition in the elite that things ideally would have to change. It's just by ad hoc ways it happens to work in other ways that than perhaps intended. So this is always tempting to quote former Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin in this case, that we wanted it to be better, but it came out as usual. So
yeah, that is always a good way to end the seminar.
Pessimistic.
So please join me in giving them a big hand. But please stay in your seats. We're not quite done yet. First, Jardar want to give some closing remarks.
Yeah, not going to take up much of your time. It's been a long day, many interesting presentations, lots of food for thought. Just would like to thank the Research and Development Department, with Vibeke and Teresa, for taking care of all things administrative, our apprentices, who have already been sent home, I believe, for helping out with practical stuff. Thanks also to our moderators, Håvard Bekken, Egil Blakkesrud, and Arild Moe. Russian politics is hardly boring. And last day's events have arguably shown that our project is highly relevant. The fact that so many of you showed up today is or that all of you actually showed up today is a proof that the topic is of interest to the Norwegian public. So I just send some thanks to the generous funding from the Norwegian Research Council. Our project will continue for 2 more years, so there's much more to come. Do follow us on our website, RUSECOPOL.com. Also make sure that you follow the IFS and FHS on social media and sign up for the FHS newsletter to keep track on upcoming events, of which our institute has many. So now please join me in giving a final hand to all of the contributors.